It is late. The world outside is swallowed by dark, the only light, the glow from your screen. An ordinary night, indistinguishable from 1,000 others. Until you hear it. A knock at the door. It is not an aggressive sound. It is soft, hesitant. A child's knock. Your first instinct is concern. Your second, something else. A cold, heavy dread that settles in your gut. A primal warning from the oldest part of your brain. You look through the peephole. They are there. 2 children, pale, in simple, outdated clothes. They do not look threatening. They look lost. They ask to come in. They need to use your phone. Their voices are polite but flat, monotonous. As you stand paralyzed by the war between help and flight, you finally see it. You see their eyes. They are not eyes at all. They are voids. Pure black, from lid to lid, dead orbs devoid of sclera or iris. This is the encounter. But it is not just one story. It is a plague of whispers. A legend born from a single journalist's terrifying 1996 report, Patient Zero for a digital nightmare. A phenomenon built on one terrifying rule. They must be invited in. What follows is an oral history of that nightmare, a dissection of the biological terror they command, and the chilling accounts of those who faced the test and failed. The roots of this fear run deep, from the digital ether of the 90s internet to the ancient folklore of changelings and vampires, to the dread of modern conspiracy. A story about the monster at the threshold, the one described as having soulless orbs like 2 great swathes of a starless night. And they are waiting for an answer. They are waiting for you to let them in. Every monster has an origin story, a moment when it crawls from the dark recesses of the collective imagination into the light. For some, this genesis is lost to the mists of time, a tale told around ancient campfires for so long that its beginning is untraceable. But the creature we now call the black-eyed child is different. It is a uniquely modern phantom, and its birth is not a mystery. It can be traced to a specific place, a specific time, and a specific text. It began in 1996 in the quiet city of Abilene, Texas, with a seasoned journalist named Brian Bethel. On a spring or summer evening, Bethel was parked in his car outside the old Camelot Communications building, a local internet service provider. He was using the dim light from a nearby movie theatre marquee to write out a check to drop in their mail slot. The night was still, wrapped in that particular quiet that can feel both peaceful and unnerving. Suddenly, a tap on his driver's side window shattered the calm. Standing there were 2 boys, somewhere between the ages of 9 and 12. Bethel would later describe them with a journalist's eye for detail. One was a somewhat suave, olive-skinned, curly-headed young man. The other, a red-headed, pale-skinned, freckled young man. Both wore hooded pullovers, their faces partially obscured. The first boy spoke, his voice steady, but strangely devoid of inflection, like a line from a script. He explained that he and his friend wanted to see the movie playing at the theatre, Mortal Kombat, but they had left their money at their mother's house. The movie they claimed to want to see, Mortal Kombat, is itself a story of interdimensional beings entering our world to steal souls. A strange, perhaps meaningless, coincidence. But the context of 1996 is crucial. The television show, The X-Files, was at the height of its popularity, feeding a public obsession with government conspiracies and the paranormal. The internet was a new, untamed frontier. It was the perfect fertile ground for a new kind of monster to be born, one that fit the paranoid, tech-savvy, and deeply uncertain spirit of the age. It was a simple, plausible request. But something was wrong. Bethel felt an immediate, overwhelming rush of fear, a terror so profound it was almost paralyzing. He glanced at the marquee. The last showing of the film was already well underway. It would be nearly over by the time they got back. This was the first crack in their story, the first sign that this was not a normal encounter. Despite the fear, Bethel felt an unexplainable pull towards them, a strange compulsion to comply. The boy continued his appeal, his tone growing more insistent.
It'd only take a moment. We're just two little kids. We don't have a gun or anything.
The words were meant to be reassuring, but they had the opposite effect. They were the words of something pretending to be a child, something that had learned the script, but not the music. As the boy spoke, Bethel felt his own hand, seemingly of its own volition, begin to move toward the door lock. He was in the process of opening his car to these strangers, acting against every screaming instinct in his body, as if under some form of low-level hypnosis. In that moment, he broke the spell. He snapped his gaze away from the boy's face, and finally, truly, looked at his eyes. They were, in Bethel's now famous words, coal black. No pupil, no iris. They were soulless orbs that seemed to absorb the flickering light from the marquee, but reflect nothing back. The sight jolted him back to reality. His heart pounded in his chest. He gripped the steering wheel, every fibre of his being now screaming at him to escape. He muttered a few excuses, trying to keep his voice steady. The boy's demeanour instantly changed. The mask of polite pleading fell away, replaced by a look of animalistic anger. Their voices, now in unison, became a forceful demand.
Let us in! Let us in! Let us in!
One of them added a chilling clarification, a phrase that would become a cornerstone of the entire legend.
We can't come in unless you tell us it's okay! Let us in!
In a panic, Bethel slammed the car into gear, the tyres screeching as he sped away from the curb. He glanced in his rearview mirror, expecting to see the two boys shrinking in the distance. But they were gone. They had vanished into the night air as if they had never been there at all. Shaken, Bethel drove home and locked every door and window. For days he couldn't sleep, haunted by the fantasy of them appearing at the foot of his bed. He knew he had to document what had happened. He wrote down his account and, in an act that would change the landscape of modern folklore, he posted it to a ghost-related mailing list. This was not a modern blog or a social media app. This was the early, text-based wilderness of the internet, Usenet, a place of digital bulletin boards, raw information, and anonymous voices. Bethel likely posted his story to a newsgroup like alt.folklore.ghost stories, a primitive digital campfire where such tales were traded. That post was the spark. It was patient zero. In the nascent ecosystem of the early internet, the story didn't just spread, it replicated. It became a classic example of what we now call creepypasta. Unlike ancient myths, the black-eyed child legend has a source code, a foundational text written with the credible, observant voice of a professional journalist. This gave it a unique authority, the core elements, the polite but insistent request for entry, the overwhelming sense of dread, the hypnotic persuasion, the need for permission, and of course the solid black eyes, were all present in that first account. They became the unwritten rules of the phenomenon, a stable genetic code that would be passed down through thousands of subsequent retellings. The story gained such popularity that Bethel himself had to publish a FAQ to handle the sheer volume of questions. Years later, he would retell his story on the reality TV series Monsters and Mysteries in America, and write a follow-up article for the Abilene Reporter News, maintaining his steadfast belief that his encounter was real. By then, it was too late. The ghost he had released from the machine was already loose in the world, knocking on other doors, in other towns, in the dead of night. After Brian Bethel's story escaped onto the internet, something strange began to happen. Other stories emerged from the digital ether, accounts from different people in different places, all describing terrifyingly similar encounters. It was as if Bethel hadn't just shared a personal anecdote. He had given a name and a face to a phenomenon that was already lurking in the shadows. These new stories cemented the legend's modus operandi and, more chillingly, began to reveal the horrific consequences for those who failed the test, for those who, out of pity or fear, made the fatal mistake of saying yes. Perhaps the most detailed and disturbing of these accounts comes from a snowy, isolated town in Vermont. In January 2016, during a raging blizzard, an elderly couple heard 3 loud knocks on their front door. Outside stood a young boy and girl, shivering in the cold. They didn't make eye contact, but simply stated, "Parents will be here soon. May we come in?" Though hesitant, the couple's compassion won out, and they invited the children inside to get warm. The children settled on the couch, silent and unresponsive to the husband's questions, while the wife went to make them hot cocoa. The first sign that something was terribly wrong came from the family pets. The couple's cats, normally calm, became terrified and aggressive, hissing at the young visitors. The children then made a simple request.
May we please use the restroom?
As the wife turned to direct them, the light caught their faces, and for the first time, she saw their eyes. They were, she said, as black as a starless universe. At that exact moment, 2 things happened simultaneously. Her husband cried out, covering his face with his hand, which came away slick with blood from a sudden, violent nosebleed. And the power in the house went out, plunging the home into a darkness as complete as the children's eyes. After a few moments of terrifying silence, the children's voices echoed from the end of the hall in perfect unison.
Our parents are here.
They walked to the front door, opened it, and left it hanging wide to the storm. The wife looked out past them and saw a black car idling at the end of the driveway. Standing beside it were 2 men, described as being very tall and slender. She waved, a nervous, reflexive gesture, but they did not wave back. The children got into the car, and it drove away into the night. The power came back on moments later, but their ordeal was far from over. In the week that followed, a plague of misfortune descended upon the couple. 3 of their 4 cats vanished without a trace. The 4th was found dead, lying in a pool of its own blood. The husband's nosebleeds continued, and a visit to the doctor delivered a devastating diagnosis, a very aggressive form of skin cancer. The wife, too, began to suffer from chronic nosebleeds and other unexplained medical issues. They had let the children in, and in doing so, had invited a curse into their lives, a lingering contamination that brought with it decay, sickness, and death. This pattern of a single, fateful choice leading to dire consequences appears again and again. The encounter is not a passive haunting, it is an active test. The home, the car, the office, these are not just locations, but sacred personal spaces. The request to enter is a request to cross a symbolic threshold into a person's life. Saying no, as Brian Bethel did, results in terror, but ultimate safety. Saying yes, as the Vermont couple did, is an act of consent that unleashes catastrophic forces. This test has been reported by witnesses from all walks of life. One of the most compelling accounts comes from a US Marine, a man trained for combat, stationed at Camp Lejeune, North Carolina. One night, he heard a knock on his barracks door. Outside stood 2 children. The familiar script began. They were lost. They needed to use a phone. The Marine, sensing an immediate and profound wrongness, refused. He reported feeling the same unnatural hypnotic pull Bethel described, a desperate urge to open the door despite his training. The children's politeness quickly turned to anger. He stared at them through the peephole, terrified, as they began to pound on the door, their childlike voices replaced with a growling, inhuman rage. He, like Bethel, survived by saying no. The encounter left a combat veteran shaken to his core. The legend is not confined to America. In the United Kingdom, the woodlands of Cannock Chase in Staffordshire have become a notorious hotspot. Sightings here allegedly predate Bethel's 1996 post, with the first reports surfacing in the early 1980s. Local paranormal investigator Lee Brickley has documented a wave of encounters, including one from his own aunt, who in 1982 claimed to see a young girl with solid black eyes. The Cannock Chase version has its own unique, terrifying flavour. Witnesses report hearing a child's screams. When they rush to help, they find a young girl, often in a white dress, with her hands covering her eyes. When she lowers them, she reveals the black voids, and a wave of panic hits the witness. The girl then giggles and vanishes. Theories for this local variant are grim. Some believe she is the ghost of a child who died of diphtheria in the 1800s, a disease which can cause severe bruising and swelling, making the eyes appear dark and sunken. Others claim she is the spirit of one of several children murdered in the area in the 1960s, a girl who was found blindfolded. This specific local variant is part of a much larger tapestry of high strangeness in the area. Cannock Chase has been a hotspot for the anomalous for decades, earning it a reputation as a portal or a window area. Reports don't just include the black-eyed girl, but also sightings of werewolves, phantom black dogs, UFOs, and even a local creature known as the Pig Man. This suggests to some researchers that the BEKs, or black-eyed kids, are not a singular, isolated phenomenon, but perhaps one expression of a larger, stranger reality that bleeds through into our own in these liminal places. The legend proved remarkably adaptable, moving from lonely roadsides and quiet homes into the mundane spaces of modern life. In 2010, a man working a late shift in an Ohio office stepped outside for a cigarette and noticed 2 teenagers across the street staring at him. Unsettled, he went back inside to his cubicle. A moment later, he looked at his security monitors and saw them standing directly in front of the building's entrance, motioning for him to come outside. When he went to the door, they insisted they just needed to use a phone. As if reading his mind, they told him there was no need to call the police. He refused their request and watched in horror as one continued to stare directly into the security camera, while the other walked around to the back of the building, his gaze tracking the other cameras as if he could see exactly what the man inside was seeing. The man called the police, never taking his eyes off the video feed. But when the officer arrived moments later, the teenagers were gone. They had vanished from a locked, monitored area without a trace. As the legend migrated to online forums like Reddit's No Sleep, a space where fictional horror stories are presented as true accounts and readers are asked to suspend their disbelief, the tales grew even darker. One of the most terrifying of these modern iterations tells the story of a man in Michigan who heard a frantic pounding on his door late one night in 1992. He opened it to find 2 children, a boy and a girl, barefoot in the freezing November cold. Taking pity on them, he let them in to use his phone. He left them in the living room for only a moment as he went to the kitchen to retrieve it. When he returned, they were gone. The house was eerily silent. A feeling of pure fear washed over him as he ran upstairs to check on his sleeping wife and children. He found the door to his bedroom locked from the inside. Then he heard it, the sounds of his wife being brutally murdered, the crunching and snapping of bones. He ran to his children's room, but that door slammed shut as well, and he heard the same horrific sounds from within. He was locked out, forced to listen to the slaughter of his entire family. After a minute of agonizing silence, the door to his children's room opened, and the 2 children stepped out. They were covered in blood. In this version, the consequence was not a slow curse, but an immediate, incomprehensible explosion of violence. The legend had adapted, becoming more graphic, more immediate, and more terrifying than ever. It was clear. Whatever these children were, the price for failing their test was absolute. The stories are terrifying. The consistency across them is chilling, but to truly understand the power of the black-eyed children, we must move beyond the anecdotal and into the clinical. We must dissect the legend and examine its components under a microscope. When we do, we find that this is not just a random ghost story. It is a finely tuned psychological weapon, an entity seemingly engineered to exploit the deepest vulnerabilities of the human mind. Its horror is not a matter of opinion. It is a matter of biology. The first layer of this psychological attack is a concept known in robotics and aesthetics as the uncanny valley. The theory, first proposed by roboticist Masahiro Mori in 1970, states that as a robot, or artificial human, becomes more realistic, our emotional response to it becomes increasingly positive, until it reaches a point where it is almost perfectly human. At that point, our affinity plummets into a deep chasm of revulsion and fear. We are no longer looking at a good robot. We are looking at a broken human, a glitch in the code, a corpse at the table. The black-eyed children reside deep within this valley. They are a near-perfect mimicry of a child, a form we are biologically programmed to trust and protect. But the mimicry is flawed. Witnesses consistently report subtle yet deeply unsettling imperfections. Their skin is too pale, their movements are slightly unnatural, their clothing is often old-fashioned or out of place, and their speech is unnervingly mature, delivered in a flat, rehearsed monotone. These are the glitches in the simulation, the small signals of wrongness that our brains detect, triggering a powerful sense of unease long before the final, horrifying reveal of their eyes. This manipulation of our perception of childhood is a classic horror trope. The evil child archetype, seen in films from The Bad Seed to The Omen and The Exorcist, is effective precisely because it inverts one of our most fundamental assumptions, that children are symbols of innocence and purity. It attacks our biological imperative to nurture. When this symbol is corrupted, when the vessel of innocence becomes a harbinger of doom, it creates a profound cognitive dissonance. This archetype is perhaps most perfectly crystallized in the 1960 film Village of the Damned. In it, a group of unnervingly similar platinum blonde children are born simultaneously in a small village. They possess hive mind intelligence, telepathic abilities, and glowing eyes. They are, in essence, a parasitic alien species masquerading as human children. The film tapped into the same Cold War anxieties of infiltration and the enemy within that the black-eyed child legend exploits today. They are the ultimate other hidden behind the ultimate symbol of us. The black-eyed children weaponize this trope to its fullest extent. They use the disguise of a helpless child as a lure, a mask of vulnerability to conceal a core of pure malevolence. This forces the victim into an impossible psychological bind, where the instinct to nurture is in direct conflict with the instinct for self-preservation. But the true genius of the legend, the core of its biological terror, lies in the eyes. The human eye is not just an organ for sight, it is the primary interface for social connection. From the moment we are born, our brains are wired to fixate on the eyes of others. We use them to read emotion, to gauge intent, to build trust, and to signal danger. A crucial part of this process involves the sclera, the white part of the eye. Our brain's fear center, the amygdala, is highly sensitive to the amount of visible sclera. When someone is afraid, their eyes widen, exposing more of the sclera. This acts as a clear, non-verbal signal of a potential threat in the environment, and our amygdala processes this information instantly, often pre-consciously, putting us on high alert before we even know why we're afraid. This is what neuroscientist Joseph Ledoux calls the low road of fear. Information from our eyes hits a sensory hub in the brain called the thalamus. From there, it takes two paths. The high road goes to the cortex, our rational, thinking brain, which slowly analyzes the situation. It's just a child, I should help. But the low road is a quick and dirty signal that goes straight from the thalamus to the amygdala. This path bypasses logic entirely, triggering the physical, gut-level fear response, the pounding heart, the cold dread, before the conscious mind has even finished processing the image. When we see the BEKs, the high road, logic, and the low road, fear, are in a total screaming conflict. The eyes of the black-eyed children are a complete and total negation of this fundamental biological system. By being solid black, they possess no sclera, no iris, and no pupil. This is not merely a cosmetic difference, it is a catastrophic data corruption. When we look at them, our brain is denied the single most important source of information for social processing. We cannot read their emotions. We cannot follow their gaze. We cannot determine their intent. They are a blank slate of pure, unreadable threat. The encounter presents our brain with two contradictory pieces of information: the shape of a child's face, which signals ally, and a pair of eyes that signal a complete void of social data, which registers as danger. This conflict short-circuits our perceptual system. The overwhelming, inexplicable sense of dread that every witness reports is not a supernatural aura. It is the brain's emergency broadcast system, a cognitive error message screaming that its core social processing software has crashed. Skeptics, of course, offer rational explanations. They point to mydriasis, a condition where the pupils become abnormally dilated. This can be caused by certain drugs, brain injury, or even a simple adrenaline rush in a dark environment. In dim light, a normal pupil can dilate to 8 millimeters, covering a large portion of the iris and creating the illusion of a black eye. Others suggest the rise of novelty contact lenses, solid black sclera lenses, popular in goth and costume subcultures. Another proposed rational explanation is the phenomenon of infrasound. These are very low-frequency sounds, below 20 Hz, inaudible to the human ear, but they can be felt. Studies have shown that infrasound, often generated by weather patterns or even faulty ventilation systems, can cause feelings of profound unease, dread, paranoia, and even visual hallucinations, a presence in the room. It has been suggested that haunted locations may simply be locations with high levels of infrasound. Could it be that these encounters are simply a perfect storm of low light, a suggestive story, and a blast of infrasound, creating a waking nightmare? But these explanations crumble under scrutiny. Mydriasis does not create a perfect pitch-black orb, and it certainly doesn't explain the hypnotic pull or the shared paralytic fear. And contact lenses don't explain the sightings in the 1980s, long before such items were commercially available, nor do they account for the plagues of misfortune that follow. The terror of the black-eyed children is not subjective. It is a predictable neurological response to a set of stimuli that have been, whether by accident or by design, perfectly calibrated to bypass our rational mind and trigger our most primal fears. They are not just a story. They are an exploit, a piece of code that targets the deepest hardware of human consciousness. While the black-eyed children may seem like a uniquely modern nightmare, born from a single email in the digital dawn, their roots run much deeper. If you peel back the layers of this 21st century legend, you find the bones of much older, more ancient fears. This creature is not a new invention. It is a chilling synthesis, a folkloric aggregator that has absorbed the most terrifying traits of several timeless monsters and repackaged them for a new generation. It is an old ghost, haunting a new machine. The most immediate and obvious parallel is to the vampire. The central rule of the black-eyed child encounter, the absolute necessity of being invited across a threshold, is a cornerstone of classic vampire mythology. This belief stems from Eastern European folklore, where creatures like the Strigoi or Nosferatu were bound by specific ancient laws. A vampire, for all its power, is traditionally helpless before a locked door or an uninvited entry. This rule does something brilliant from a narrative perspective. It shifts the agency. The victim is no longer a passive target, but an active participant in their own damnation. The horror comes not from a violent assault, but from a moment of choice, a single word, yes, that seals their fate. The black-eyed children borrow this powerful mechanic, transforming their encounters from simple hauntings into moral and psychological tests, where the victim's own compassion or weakness becomes the instrument of their downfall. A deeper and more resonant connection, however, can be found in the folklore of the changeling. For centuries, European folklore was haunted by the fear that fairies, or the fae, would steal a healthy human infant from its crib and leave a sickly, uncanny substitute in its place. This changeling would look like the original child, but it would be fundamentally other. Old Irish and Scottish tales describe changelings with disturbing precision. They are often wizened in appearance, with long teeth and a sullen demeanour. They possess an intellect far beyond their apparent years, and an uncanny insight. Most terrifyingly, their innocence was gone. their eyes having lost their light, replaced with a knowing darkness. They were ravenous, draining the family's resources, and were said to engage in strange behaviour when they thought they were alone, like dancing or playing instruments with unnatural skill. The reason for the abduction was just as sinister. Sometimes the Fae simply coveted a beautiful human child. Other times the child was a tithe to hell, an offering the fairies were forced to pay, as described in the Ballad of Tam Lin. In some tales, the Fae would swap an elderly fairy for a human baby, allowing the old creature to live out its final days in comfort, coddled by human parents. The cures for a changeling were brutal. It was believed that torturing the creature by holding it over a fire or on a hot shovel would force it to reveal its true form and jump up the chimney, returning the human child. This belief was not just a story. It was responsible for centuries of documented child abuse and even murder. The most famous case is that of Bridget Cleary in 1895 Ireland, who was burned to death by her husband because he was convinced she was a changeling. The black-eyed children are the modern incarnation of this fear. They are the ultimate imposters, perfectly mimicking the form of a child to exploit our instinct to help. The ancient fear of the monster in the crib has simply moved to the other side of the door. But the legend doesn't stop there. It also weaves in the anxieties of the 20th century, specifically the mythos of aliens and government conspiracy. Let us return to the Vermont encounter, where the two children, after terrorizing the elderly couple, were seen leaving with two very tall and slender men in black suits who drove a black car. This detail is a direct and unmistakable link to the legend of the Men in Black. The MIB mythos began in 1953 with a ufologist named Albert K. Bender. After claiming to have discovered the truth about flying saucers, Bender was allegedly visited by three men in black suits who threatened him into silence. The story was popularized by author Gray Barker in his 1956 book, They Knew Too Much About Flying Saucers. These MIBs were described as being just as off as the black-eyed children, speaking in flat, robotic monotones, moving awkwardly, and appearing somehow inhuman. The folklorist and author John Keel, who famously investigated the Mothman prophecies in the 1960s, had a different name for these entities. He didn't believe in aliens from other planets, but in ultra-terrestrials, beings that are not from space, but from a coexisting parallel dimension. He described his MIB encounters in the exact same uncanny valley terms: robotic, pale, with strange, ill-fitting clothes and large, dark eyes. He saw them as cosmic tricksters, deceptive entities that have always been with us, merely changing their masks to fit the beliefs of the era, from fairies and goblins to, in his time, alien pilots. In this light, the BEKs are just another mask, one tailored for the 21st century. This connection fuels one of the most popular theories about the children's nature, that they are not ghosts or demons, but alien-human hybrids. Their solid black eyes are seen as a parallel to the large, dark, almond-shaped eyes of the classic grey alien. In this context, the Men in Black are not just random companions. They are their handlers, their guardians, or perhaps their creators. This places the BEK phenomenon firmly within the phantom hitchhiker archetype, one of the most persistent urban legends worldwide. But the BEK legend inverts this trope in a terrifying way. The phantom hitchhiker asks for a ride home and then vanishes, a passive, melancholy spirit. The black-eyed child asks for a ride or for entry into your home, and its intentions are anything but passive. It doesn't want to go home. It wants to come to yours. This synthesis is what makes the black-eyed child such a potent and enduring modern monster. It doesn't rely on a single source of fear. It borrows the vampire's rules of engagement, the changeling's method of infiltration, and the alien mythos's cosmic scale. It is a modular nightmare, an old evil that has learned new and terrifying tricks. For every chilling tale of a late-night encounter, there is an equal and opposite force of skepticism. From a rational perspective, the phenomenon of the black-eyed children seems to evaporate under scrutiny. Science writer Sharon A. Hill, after extensive investigation, was unable to find any verifiable documentation of a single encounter, concluding that the tales are passed on as friend of a friend ghost stories, a classic form of contemporary folklore. Fact-checking websites like Snopes have decisively categorized the legend as just that, a legend, with no more empirical evidence to support it than Bigfoot or the Loch Ness Monster. There are no photographs, no videos, no physical traces. There are only stories. But to dismiss the black-eyed children as just a story is to miss the point entirely. It is to misunderstand the nature of fear in the digital age. The truth is, the black-eyed children are real. Their reality, however, is not written in flesh and blood, but in code and pixels. They are a ghost native to the machine. Before the internet, folklore spread slowly, passed by word of mouth, evolving like a game of telephone. The internet changed everything. It created a new kind of campfire, one that was global, instantaneous, and anonymous. On the forums of the late 1990s, a new form of storytelling emerged: creepypasta. This phenomenon was predicted, in a sense, by evolutionary biologist Richard Dawkins. In 1976, he coined the term meme to describe a unit of cultural transmission. In his 1991 essay, Viruses of the Mind, he argued that ideas, particularly religious ones, function like viruses. They don't spread because they are supported by evidence. They spread through epidemiology. They are successful if they contain instructions for their own replication, such as, "Thou shalt spread the word." The black-eyed child legend is a perfect mimetic virus. It's a package, as Dawkins would say, of mutually compatible ideas. The uncanny child, the vampire's threshold, the alien's eyes. It's sticky, it's frightening, and it's designed to be shared. The black-eyed child legend is a masterclass in this digital sleight of hand. The stories are almost always presented as first-hand testimonials, using phrases like, "This happened to me." Our brains are psychologically primed to give more weight to personal testimony than to acknowledged fiction. When thousands of these anonymous testimonials accumulate, they create a crowd-sourced mythology, a vast tapestry of seemingly independent accounts that all point to the same terrifying truth. It feels like corroboration, a chorus of voices that is harder to dismiss than a single author. This crowd-sourced mythology is amplified by a sociological phenomenon known as legend tripping. This is the act of visiting a place where a legend is said to have occurred in the hopes of experiencing it. Teenagers visit haunted bridges, and ghost hunters flock to Cannock Chase. The very act of visiting, primed by the story, makes an encounter more likely. A normal shadow becomes a monster. A strange noise becomes a whisper. These legend trippers then return and share their corroborating experiences online, adding another layer to the story, which in turn inspires the next wave of trippers. The legend becomes a self-perpetuating, experiential feedback loop. These digital legends are so effective because they tap directly into our modern anxieties. While classic urban legends focused on fears of contaminated food or killers in the back seat, today's digital folklore preys on our fears of isolation, surveillance, and the porous boundary between our online and offline lives. The black-eyed child is the perfect avatar for these fears. It is the ultimate, unknowable other, a perfect metaphor for the countless disembodied entities we interact with every day through our screens. Therefore, the reality of the black-eyed child is not proven by its physical footprint, but by its digital one. It lives in the stories, the artwork, the videos, and the late-night discussions it has inspired. It is a ghost whose existence is confirmed every time someone feels a chill while reading a story online, every time someone hesitates before opening their door after dark. But the legend has performed one last, terrifying trick in its evolution. A new rule has been added to the mythology, a piece of viral code attached to the story as it spreads. It is a warning, whispered in the comment sections. Once you become aware of them, they become aware of you. They say the black-eyed children only come if you know about them. This is a brilliant and insidious narrative device. It breaks the fourth wall, transforming the act of consuming the story into a potentially dangerous act. This trope was perfected in other digital legends, like the story of Ben Drowned, a haunted Legend of Zelda cartridge where a malevolent AI spoke to the reader through the story's text, using phrases like, "You've met with a terrible fate, haven't you?" The Slender Man mythos, which began as a simple Photoshop contest, evolved to include the idea that knowing about him is what drew his attention. The story becomes a vector for the curse itself. The legend is no longer just a story you are reading. It is a story that is now reading you. This is a perfect metaphor for how information works in the digital age. Once you have been exposed to a disturbing idea, you cannot unsee it. It has crossed the threshold of your screen and taken up residence in your mind. The story has, in a sense, been let in. The legend of the black-eyed children has become self-referential. A horror story about the terrifying nature of horror stories themselves. For decades, the legend of the black-eyed children has haunted us with a single, terrifying question. If they came to your door, would you let them in? We have dissected their origins, analysed their methods, and traced their lineage. We have seen the horrific consequences for those who answered yes, and the lingering terror for those who said no. We have understood that the fear they inspire is a calculated assault on our deepest psychological instincts. But in all this time, we have been asking the wrong question. The true horror of this legend is not about a hypothetical encounter at our physical doorstep. The real test is happening right now. The real invitation is one we receive and accept 1,000 times a day. The central plea of the black-eyed child is always the same. Let me in. It is a request for access, for permission to cross a boundary from the outside world into a private, protected space. Today, that threshold is no longer made of wood and steel. It is the glass of a screen. Every time we click accept, every time we grant an app permissions, every time we scroll through a feed curated by an invisible algorithm, we are issuing an invitation. We are letting them in. Author Shoshana Zuboff calls this surveillance capitalism. It's an architecture of extraction, one that claims our personal data as its raw material. We willingly open the doors to our minds, the most private spaces of all, to entities we do not know and cannot possibly understand. The black-eyed child is the perfect ghost for the 21st century because it is a symbol of the technology we hold in our hands. It is persuasive, presenting a helpful, even childlike interface. It is uncanny, an almost perfect mimicry of human interaction that is just slightly off. And behind that interface is a black box, a complex, unknowable algorithm whose true motives are hidden from us. We look into our devices and we see a reflection of ourselves, but behind that reflection is a void, an unreadable, data-collecting, behavior-modifying darkness. Its goal is not to kill us, but to nudge us, to shape our behavior with the same hypnotic pull that Brian Bethel felt in his car. The knock at the door is no longer a sound from an old ghost story. It is the notification chime on your phone. It is the endless, hypnotic scroll of a personalized reality tailored to your deepest desires and fears. It is the technology in your pocket, constantly and politely asking for permission, waiting for you to say yes, waiting for you to let it in. And we always do.